causation would have to be accepted as a legitimate form of scientific explanation. Basically, intelligent design doesn't work unless you have a designer. And how can you have a designer if we're not talking about something that is supernatural in nature? You might counter that by saying, well, couldn't the designer be an alien, or couldn't the designer be another civilization from another time on this planet, or who knows what, some other idea? And the answer is yes, technically that could be the case. However, that wouldn't necessarily fit within design in terms of what the intelligent design movement is interested in. That would actually fit within evolutionary theory of a sort, in that it would not explain the ultimate origin of that designing entity. It gets a little convoluted, but you get the idea. Okay. You also won't find individuals at the school board level advocating for the cosmic alien designer, right? It ain't going to happen. I hope you found it interesting in the video how, under cross-examination, Behe was forced to concede that under this view of science that astrology would count as a legitimate line of scientific inquiry. To be honest, I'm not interested in teaching astrology in biology class, so for no other reason, I'm not a fan of Behe for that reason. Okay. Intelligent design has largely been criticized as an elaborate argument from ignorance. Essentially, the idea here is that intelligent design only seems to carry weight when there's an absence of data to evaluate the claim on. And the more data and the more evidence that we generate, the less likely it seems that the intelligent design interpretation is correct. Intelligent design at rock bottom is an anti-evolutionary movement, as we've seen. Most anti-evolutionary movements take this approach in that they focus on areas that are not well understood. Interestingly, in this process, they make predictions. They don't make predictions based on their own hypothesis. They're making negative predictions about the ability of evolution to do certain things. And we'll see an example of this. So they don't make positive predictions from their own perspective, but they do make negative predictions about evolution. So even though these aren't positive predictions that come off of a theory, they are in fact predictions that can be tested. So these predictions that they make, negative though they are testable predictions, and we'll see here as an example one such prediction that Behe makes. This is from a talk that he gave at a you can see the URL here if you want to go look at it. This is from a talk that he gave at a symposium about design philosophy and such. And he's discussing, interestingly enough for our purposes, this is an area of evolutionary biology that you're a bit versed in because we talked about whale evolution previously. He's making a negative prediction based on that, in that field. He's saying, okay, this form has just been found, this thing called Mezonachid. It's just been found. This is a terrestrial organism, and this other whale, Zeglodon, which had just been discovered at the time. And he's basically saying, look, if evolutionary theory is true, then there has to be multiple transitional forms in the fossil record that link up these two species. And isn't it interesting that the only thing we've found looks a heck of a lot like the species that we know about now? If you remember from what we talked about in Lecture 5, do you remember the basilosaurids? They're the ones right at the end that were originally thought to be reptiles. They were known from, like, say, the 1800s or so. But that was all they had at that point. They had modern whales and these things that looked a lot like modern whales because they were the sort of last one down. So he's saying, look, if evolution's true, then all these forms should be found in the fossil record. And guess what? They're not found. And the only things we see are things that look a lot like the modern species. So if you are a believer in the unabating rule of natural law, you could say, yeah. Then regardless of the evidence, you can get from here to there. He makes an analogy in saying like you could jump over the Grand Canyon. Now, you might say, okay, if there's little spots that you can land and jump to, or eventually you'll get over the Grand Canyon, but he says, look, I'm a skeptic. I'm asking to be shown the steps along the way. Essentially, show me the transitional forms that link up these two this isn't in your notes, but just to remind you of the different converging lines of of evidence that support the hypothesis of whale evolution that we've been talking about. You might ask yourself the question, well, why is Behe making this argument? There's all these transitional forms known. Why is Behe making this argument? Well, he made the argument in 1992. And like I mentioned in Lecture 5, we've learned a lot about whale evolution since 1992. Back in 1992, there were very few forms that were known in terms of transitional forms in the fossil record. So since this time when Behe made this prediction, he made a negative prediction. He said evolution is going to be shown up that it won't have these forms in the fossil record. And isn't that typical of evolution? They say there's all these little transitional forms from form A to form B. Show me the evidence. I'm going to be a skeptic until you show me the evidence. Well, we now have much better data than we did in 1992. And it's interesting to note that Behe doesn't use this line of argumentation anymore, obviously, because it doesn't work. There's more evidence now to suggest that that line of argumentation isn't a fruitful one for him. We still see that line of argumentation, though, but it's at this level. Like we were discussing previously between the differences between the type 3 secretory system and the flagellum. Behe is now asking to say, fine, I'll believe it when you show me all the different transitional forms that exist between these two entities. Well, the issue is, this is not something that's very amenable to investigation because these forms don't fossilize in the way that whole organisms do. What we have as evidence is the genetics of species that exist now. We can look at various species of bacteria that have flagella, that have a type 3 secretory system. We can compare their genes, but that's about as good as the evidence is going to get. But Behe has put himself in a position where he says, unless you show me every single transitional form, unless you show me every single variant between these two forms, and the selective conditions of the environment that led to the beneficial aspect of those mutations, he says, I'm not going to accept it. Well, the irony there is that's a very high level of, a very high bar in terms of evidence level. And I find that somewhat ironic from the position of, if I look back at his own hypotheses, there's no evidence provided at all for the hypotheses that he's advancing. Your mileage may vary, but that's where I fall out. Okay, so what's interesting to me from the intelligent design community perspective is that it's not just so-called materialistic, Darwinistic scientists who are saying this is not a good idea, this is not a valid avenue of science. It's also outfits like the Templeton Foundation. You may have heard of the Templeton Foundation. These are the deep pockets people. If you are interested in research on theology, society, the interaction of science and religion, I mean, look at sort of the things they fund. You know, research on spiritual development and spiritual transformation, prayer and meditation. You would think if anybody was open to the notion of a theistic view of biology, that these folks would be interested in it. But what we find is that they've specifically disavowed the intelligent design movement, and they make a point of saying so on their website because they've received some criticism in the past because they have funded a few individuals who have then gone on to identify themselves as members of the intelligent design movement. So because of that, the Templeton Foundation got criticized and said, look, you're just a group that's funding this bogus science. And they said, no, we didn't know at the time that these people were going to go on to become intelligent design movement members. We don't think the science underpinning intelligent design is sound. We do not support research or programs that deny large areas of well-documented scientific knowledge. And the foundation is a non-political entity. We don't support or engage in political movements. They basically say, we do not, they term the intelligent design movement as a political movement, not a scientific one. It's too bad, because they're a very good funding agency. They've got lots of money. Okay. So, strengths and weaknesses of intelligent design as a model of integration between biology and Christian faith. Well, it certainly has as a strength that it's very popular in its support level in the North American